ages, Britain has had its fair share of bloodthirsty rulers, but one stands out uniquely. A monarch whose reign was filled with burnings, torture and beheadings. A monarch who executed more people for their religious beliefs than the Spanish Inquisition did in the same 5 years. A monarch who was a woman. Bloody in action and bloody in name, this is the story of Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. It is the story of a tyrant losing her mind and losing control, and persecuting her own people in a crazed attempt to make them obey her will and worship her God. Mary's father, Henry VIII, had abandoned the Catholic religion and turned England into a Protestant country. Her brother, Edward VI, had followed fanatically in her father's footsteps. But when Mary finally became queen in 1553, her one burning ambition was to turn England into a Catholic country once again. It shouldn't have been that difficult. Most of the English were still Catholic at heart anyway, but Mary's methods were so brutal that by the time she died in 1558, her people hated both her and her religion. A reign that ended so badly started very well. At first, the new queen was massively popular. But in February 1554, her power was challenged. Gentleman Thomas Wyatt gathered an army of 7,000 men in the countryside of Kent and marched on London. Mary had little time to prepare a defence force. On the 5th of February, Wyatt reached the city limits. When he got here, however, he had terrible trouble crossing the Thames, because many of the bridges had been destroyed in anticipation of his arrival. While Wyatt spent days frantically trying to find a way across the river, most of his men got bored and deserted. Wyatt did eventually find a bridge and crossed with his remaining 500 men. He didn't really stand a chance against the Queen's army, and his meagre troops were soon overwhelmed. Those left standing were carted off to prisons all over London. Wyatt himself was taken straight to the Tower. Mary had crushed the first threat to her throne easily, but the Queen's wrath had been awakened. She didn't just want victory, she wanted revenge. So tell me, Geoffrey, what exactly would they have done to Thomas Wyatt?
Thomas Wyatt was tortured on the rack, an instrument of gentle persuasion, to make him admit the names of his fellow conspirators.
Mary was determined to hunt down everyone involved in the plot. Wyatt said he'd rebelled to prevent her planned marriage to the Catholic Prince Philip of Spain, but Mary suspected his secret aim had been to depose her, and she wanted evidence. In a sort of very caring, sort of gentle way, could you show me how this works?
It cannot be performed charitably at all. As the wheel is turned, the machine slowly stretches you.
So it does.
An endurable agony. It could dislocate your shoulder blades, your knees, your hips, and your ankles if you fail to submit. Tell us all you know.
Oh, I've got cramp.
Or else, come on. Give in.
What was the question again?
Who were your fellow conspirators?
Oh, God, I used to know that.
Who was your fellow conspirators?
Ask me a football question.
One rackmaster boasted that his victims left the rack a foot taller than their God had made them.
I see. Up to a certain point, it's a bit like osteopathy, isn't it, this? Except Mary didn't have the prisoner's health in mind. She was desperate for information. After the rack came this, the latest addition to the Tower's torture chamber.
It is known as the Scavenger's or Skeffington's daughter, after the man who brought it to the Tower of London in the 1530s, just in time for Mary's reign.
How handy. And how does it work?
You would put your feet through there.
Yes.
Your hands in those two.
Oh, yes.
And if it was larger, your head into the upper ring.
If this was
and
larger.
there you would stay.
Oh.
That's it.
You don't have to push, thank you. The Scavenger's daughter would slowly crush its victim between its iron rings. God, it's very uncomfortable even like this. So what's the purpose of this then?
It compressed your internal organs. It bent your spine, and there you stayed until the blood exuded from your nose, your mouth, your ears, and other bodily orifices.
Very nasty indeed, Geoffrey. Despite weeks of torture, Wyatt refused to crack. Mary tried everything. Now, what are these then, Geoffrey?
Those are thumb screws.
Oh, right. At first sight, they look rather namby-pamby to be a torture instrument. So how does it work? You put your thumbs in between the two bars, is that right?
That is correct.
And then something horrible happens.
Then the executioner tightens the screw on the upper bar,
Oh, hello. Yeah, and you...
crushing your thumbnail.
Yes, I can see that would be very painful. Well, look, just keep on screwing down and I'll just see how much I can stand. See how butch I really am.
It's going to hurt.
Just squeeze away. You're not going to hurt me. You're not going to... No! Take off! Get you later. In her treatment of Thomas Wyatt, Bloody Mary was starting to reveal her true colours. She promised to strike terror into those who ventured to do evil, whoever they were. It was a challenge to one person in particular. Mary was trying to extract evidence that Wyatt's plot involved her Protestant sister, Elizabeth, later to be Elizabeth I. But Thomas Wyatt refused to incriminate Elizabeth, so after 2 months, Mary gave up. Wyatt was executed along with about 100 of his men. Most of the rebels were subjected to the horrifying ordeal of being hanged, drawn, and quartered.
First of all, you were hanged.
Right.
Sit here. There you would be suspended from the gallows and then cut down before you had become unconscious.
So I'm conscious of everything that's going to happen to me for the next
You are
few
quite
minutes.
conscious.
Able to witness the rest of the torture.
That is exactly the purpose. And then you would have to submit to being castrated.
What's the point of that?
This is to ensure that you would not have any future children who just might have treacherous thoughts similar to yours.
But I'm not going to have many children after I've been quartered and hanged.
It is purely symbolic.
Right.
And then I would proceed to disembowel you. Using the slitting knife,
Right.
I slice your stomach wide open. The blood would be pouring over the scaffold board, splashing out because your heart, while you still have it, is pumping away. I would plunge my hand inside and withdraw your entrails.
I say. They're not mine.
I show them to you before your very eyes.
So I'm still alive watching all this. That's the idea.
You are indeed. Again, I reach into your parted stomach. Your liver follows.
Oh dear, it's in better condition than I imagined it.
And finally, of course, your end draws nigh as I extract your heart. At that stage, you're dead.
Thank God for that.
Following that, I would proceed to decapitate you. And your head would then be placed on London Bridge as a warning to all those entering the city, behave or else.
Okay. Right. I shouldn't be nodding at this point, should I, obviously?
No, I would be nodding your head for you. I would then finish off the process by quartering you, slicing your body into 4 more or less equal parts. The quarters would be dispatched by fast horse rider back to the towns and the cities in which you had lived and plotted,
Right.
and there they would be placed over the city gates, so that all the population, all the residents would realise what had happened to anyone who conspired against the sovereign.
Mary made an example out of Wyatt and his men. Their deaths were as horrific as possible. Their mutilated bodies stuck on stakes on street corners all over London. The Wyatt Rebellion marked a turning point in Mary's reign. After a year of restraint, she suddenly displayed a terrifying ruthlessness. Her treatment of Wyatt and his rebels was nothing compared to what was to come. In 1554, England was on the brink of a reign of terror. Mary Tudor was on the throne, and she was set on a path of destruction and persecution. It would make her one of England's most hated monarchs and earn her the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary's second year on the throne had been a pretty bloody one, to say the least. In the wake of the Wyatt Rebellion, she'd gruesomely executed over 100 of her subjects and still found time to marry the Catholic prince, Philip of Spain. But now Mary turned her full attention on stamping out heresy once and for all. Protestants already face cruel punishments for merely expressing a Protestant point of view. You might be strung up from a tree by one limb and left to hang for days. Or have your hand forcibly held in the flame of a candle. Or be sentenced to a spell in the stocks. Or even have an ear removed. Basically, if you were Protestant, you were a second-class citizen, and things were about to get even worse for you. Mary's need to stamp out the Protestant religion had an added urgency. She had no children, no Catholic heirs, so she was determined to make England as Catholic as she could while she was on the throne. But she hadn't given up the idea of having a baby. At 38, she was pretty much past it by the standards of her own time, but she seemed to think that if nothing else worked, wishful thinking might. Just after the wedding, the Queen announced that she was pregnant. There were public parties, services of thanksgiving, and foreign rulers sent messages of congratulation. 10 months later, no baby had materialised, and no public explanation was forthcoming. Now, Ivor, we hear that Mary perhaps had a phantom pregnancy. Is it possible to believe that you are pregnant, or actually to show symptoms of being pregnant?
Yes, I think the whole desire, and this can happen when people are psychologically kind of anxious.
Yeah.
She wanted to know, didn't she, to
Catholic
continue?
one.
Yes, very much so.
Because there was talk about that she wasn't all
Well, that's
completely
true.
together.
You know, she's quite abused, mentally abused as a youngster, and had deep depressions.
Mary was physically and mentally weak. She was tormented by the thought that the security of her kingdom depended on her having a child. She tried countless remedies to make herself fit enough to get pregnant. Absinthe was supposed to settle her stomach pains, ammonia to relieve her depressions, and black pepper to induce contractions. She even used these nasty-looking bloodsuckers. Why would leeches be significant in Mary's case?
Well, she was well known to have tantrums and so on, and this type of response is thought to be due to too much blood in the circulation, people getting too hot. So bloodletting by the use of leeches was quite common.
Shall we get this fellow out and have a look at him? Now, what sort of leeches this is rather?
What they do is they
Trying to get him.
puncture the skin.
Here, boy. Is it a boy?
No, shall I tell you something? They're hermaphrodites.
Are they? I
Yes.
can tell by the way they're dressed. Go on.
And they secrete a local anaesthetic in their saliva, so you don't actually feel leeches when they're applied to the skin. Now, as you see, he's
having a great
easy
time,
job,
isn't he?
and he really is.
He's like a he's like a leech in blood. Do you think any of this, all of it, would have actually been good for her or in any way helped her get pregnant?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think it made her worse.
Mary was pale, wrinkled and sickly. She had uncontrollable fits of temper and her desire for a child was becoming obsessive. The fact is, Mary didn't have a hope in hell of getting pregnant. And the longer she remained childless, the more vigorously she pursued her campaign against the Protestants. After 18 months, she passed laws allowing her to burn heretics. 283 of them met this grisly fate in just over 4 years. On average, that's one victim every 5 days. England had never seen anything like it. No one was safe from Mary's purges. Just possessing a copy of the Bible in English meant you could be burnt alive. Paranoid and terrified people betrayed their neighbours and even their own families. The executions took place in town squares all over England. The average person in Mary's England was pretty used to the idea of people being burnt at the stake. It had been going on for 150 years after all. There's usually a big crowd there, lots of children running around, cherry sellers going about their business. Most people considered it a jolly good day out. Hello? Right. Well, here we are. This is our Porky, our heretic, and this is Paul, our heretic burning expert. Now, what have you got here?
It's very thin, twiggy bits of stick. You know, they would have used brushwood originally, or straw, or reeds, or something like that. But generally, it's got to be small wood.
So the construction of the fire is quite crucial.
It is crucial, yeah. Obviously, the executioner wanted to get it right, and it would have reflected badly on him if the poor person had been just toasted a bit and not finished
Did
off
that happen?
quickly.
Did fires go out?
It did happen quite regularly, yes. There was one account I read where the fire went out, and the poor chap was left there while they sent a horse off to get more firewood. And it took 3 attempts to finish the
He
poor
said,
chap
hurry up,
off.
I'm freezing you.
Well, I don't think he said that.
And what's the bag that's tied around the neck here?
Well, this is a bag of gunpowder. This would be given to the victim by their family. They would then tie it around their neck or put it under their arms or between their legs. The
I
idea
say.
being was when the flames reached it, this bag would explode, blowing them to smithereens and hastening their demise. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Because what a lot of people don't realise now, and certainly didn't then, was that gunpowder isn't a high explosive. It's only when you contain it in a vessel that it will actually explode. So really all this would achieve was causing them horrific burns,
Yeah.
really, and just adding to their suffering, really.
Especially if it was between your legs, I'd have thought that.
Yeah, it would be rather nasty, I would
It's
imagine.
a strange sort of age, isn't it, when your loved ones tie a bag of gunpowder around you
Well, I
Gonna
mean,
take
they honestly thought
as
they
a gesture of kindness.
honestly thought they were doing them a favour.
So what's the ideal sort of weather?
Probably after we've got it today, actually. The wood's nice and dry. We've got absolutely no wind.
That's right.
So all the heat's going to go straight up.
Well, I think we should light it then.
I think we should.
Lunch. This is what the crowds were waiting for. The moment the flames were lit, everybody would jostle to get a better view. Of course, the best seats were reserved for the most important townsfolk. All right, well, I've retired to a safe distance to enjoy the afternoon's entertainment with the local dignitaries. Now, Chris, you're a forensic pathologist. What can you tell me about human flesh burning?
Human flesh will burn very well. The first thing that happens is that the skin goes red as the heat hits it. Then it will char. After that, the muscle starts to cook. Obviously, the fat itself will turn to liquid and will actually fuel the fire. There is blood in the body that will boil, and it will actually turn to something that resembles black pudding. Indeed, of course, that's what black pudding is. The rib cage will become visible, and you will be able to see the organs of the chest through the rib cage. You can see the heart and the lungs, which are cooking.
I mean, it's going to sound like a stupid question, but I mean, was it very painful?
Well, it would be painful to start with, as the skin was burnt. That's where the pain receptors are. Ironically, as it goes deeper into the tissue, then the pain receptors are destroyed.
Oh,
and
right.
it would then, for that area, would become less painful. But of course, the flames would be moving up the body, and each area would become more painful.
And you have got some sensitive areas.
You've got some very sensitive areas as you get further up.
Right, there goes the gunpowder at 12 minutes. What effect has that had on the body?
What has actually happened is, in this case, it's really just burnt around the face of poor old Porky.
Yeah. It's charred it and made it a bit sooty, hasn't it?
It has, you can see that quite clearly, but what it hasn't done is done any major damage that would have actually either rendered the person unconscious or preferably killed them.
Yeah. At what point do you die just from burning? Do we know that?
Well, it's very difficult to say with certainty. Some of them may have died very quickly. Some people may have died because as they are consumed by a rapid fire, they actually go into heart failure. They have inhaled smoke, the throat will be burnt and it may swell up, and then you may not be able to breathe properly, so you may get a sensation of suffocating. Some of these old bishops would be probably dying quite quickly in comparison with younger heretics.
It looks pretty dead to me now.
Yes, it's we are beginning to cremate that pig, I think.
So we've missed our opportunity to nip in and get a spare rib,
I
haven't
think we have.
The first high-profile heretic Mary sent to the stake was the Bishop of Gloucester, John Hooper. 7,000 people gathered to watch his horrific execution. The authorities hadn't spent enough money on wood, and the fire was weak. Hooper burned slowly. He prayed until his mouth turned black, his tongue was so swollen that he couldn't speak, and his legs and arms had burnt away. After 45 minutes of agony, he finally lost consciousness and died. It wasn't just bishops like Hooper who were dying like this. It was anybody. Farm labourers, tailors, hat makers, no estate agents, sadly. What Mary just couldn't understand was that her message simply wasn't getting through. There seemed to be an endless stream of people prepared to die for their beliefs. And the longer the fires burned, the more people started showing sympathy for the victims, even though Mary had outlawed this. But Mary had one thing up her sleeve, which she hoped would scare her people into submission. It was her prize prisoner, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer had served Henry VIII and had been the brains behind turning England Protestant. Mary despised him. Despite the fact that he was much loved by the people, she was determined to see him burned. Mary had Cranmer imprisoned in Oxford, a Catholic, conservative city, a safe place to keep such a controversial prisoner. It was in Oxford that she'd also burned Bishops Latimer and Ridley, on this very spot, overlooked by Cranmer's prison. In fact, Cranmer was forced to watch his friends burn from the window of his cell. It was a particularly horrific spectacle. Cranmer was one of the thousands who watched as these once important and powerful men were publicly executed. Hugh Latimer, Bishop of Worcester, was a 70-year-old man. Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, was once Cranmer's own chaplain. As the flames took hold, Latimer leant over to Ridley and said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day, by God's grace, light such a candle in England as I trust shall never be put out." Latimer died within minutes, but the fire on Ridley's side was weak. His death was slow and agonizing. Cranmer was horrified by what he'd seen, and so terrified of it happening to him that he abandoned the Protestant faith and became a Catholic. This normally meant that he would be spared, but he'd forgotten who he was dealing with. Bloody Mary burnt him anyway. On March 21st, 1556, he went into the fire. Cranmer held the hand which had signed his recantation into the flames so that it would burn first. Although people were used to the idea that heretics should burn, they'd never seen such important people executed in this way. They'd never seen persecution on this scale. Some people were brave enough to protest, and demonstrations broke out at the burnings and at church services. The people were turning against their queen. In private, they longed for her death and an end to the horror of the executions. Mary's dream of England becoming a Catholic country once again was dying. She knew that if her sister Elizabeth became queen, England would be Protestant once again. Her hopes of having a baby were also rapidly fading. Part of the problem was that her husband Philip generally avoided spending any time in the same country as her. He did visit his wife briefly, though, in July 1557. 6 months later, she announced that she was pregnant again. No one believed her. Mary became depressed and increasingly paranoid about her own security. She spent most of her time in bed and took to wearing armour whenever she got up. As the Queen's health deteriorated, she ordered the burnings to continue. 5 people were burned at the stake the week before she died, and she was still signing death warrants from her own deathbed. In 4 years, Mary burnt twice as many people as had been burnt in the previous 150. 227 men and 56 women had been fed to the flames, but the bloodshed was about to come to an end. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558. Throughout her reign, she waged a campaign of terror against her own people. Far from persuading them to embrace the Catholic faith, she turned them against it. England became Protestant once again, and the golden age of Elizabeth I began. But Mary left her bloody mark on the minds of her people. Their dread of having a Catholic monarch would shape England's history for generations.